His life was still a prayer, a testament of hope, despite death threats from whites and rising ridicule and rebuke from black, Uncle Tom, Martin Luther King. Still, ML looked at the world through the eyes of his Messiah. Still, he praised and preached agape, clinging to the possibility of a beloved community. He kept envisioning a day when nobody will shout white power, when nobody will shout black power, but everybody will talk about God's power and human power. That human power would be, he dreamed, healthy, healing power, power that enlightened, power that lifted people up, power infused with love, power as a tool of love. Quote, he said, power at its best is love, implementing the demands of justice, and justice at its best is power, correcting everything that stands against love. And that everything included the war in Vietnam. I have a play nephew, when his book came out, he was in his 20s, and I gave it to him. He said, I never knew Dr. King spoke out against Vietnam. And one of my favorite lines from that speech, one that I'll point to sometimes when people will say, is King still relevant? That speech at Riverside Church, but one among many things, he said, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Is King still relevant? He took a lot of heat for speaking out on Vietnam and for joining the peace movement. On top of that, he had the audacity to spearhead a march whose motto was Repent America, the Poor People's Campaign. He was dreaming of a multicultural multitude of poor folk camping out in the nation's capital, calling for economic justice. And with all that he had to do on the Poor People's Campaign, he couldn't say no when his friend Jim Lawson pleaded with him to lend his might to a movement in Memphis. There, a march King led was infiltrated by troublemakers who turned a peaceful demonstration into a riot. And back at his hotel, Mel was with Abernathy, and he got physically sick. And at one point, he said to Abernathy, maybe we just have to give up and let violence take its course. A few days later, back in Atlanta, ML's soul was revived again. Against the advice of close colleagues, he was determined to lead another march in Memphis, insisting that nonviolence could and would prevail. Memphis was coming out from under blows of a thunderstorm when ML returned on Wednesday, April 3rd. Running a slight fever and wearied by the bomb threat that had delayed their flight, he asked Abernathy to speak in his stead at that night's rally at Mason Temple. Later, when he got a call that the people wanted a message from him, he got into a suit and went out into the Memphis night wet again with rain and under tornado watch. At Mason Temple, ML urged the crowd to, quote, rise up tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination, and let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge to make America what it ought to be. His eyes were still on the prize of the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. My eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Another rally was scheduled for the next night. Before that, ML was looking forward to dinner with friends. Around 6 o'clock, he stepped outside onto the balcony, expecting Abernathy to join him any minute. And in the meantime, he exchanged pleasantries and chit-chats with colleagues down below in the courtyard. And one of them was musician Ben Branch, of whom he asked a favor. He wanted him to sing a song by Thomas Dorsey, the father of gospel music, composed when he was dealing with a double death, that of his wife and just-born baby. It's a song confessing frailty. I'm tired, I'm weak, I'm worn. It's a song professing faith. Lead me on to the light. It's a song of surrender to a power mightier than the self. Ben, make sure you play Precious Lord, Take My Hand in the meeting tonight. Seconds later, some of ML's friends heard that what they thought was a firecracker. Others thought a car had backfired. Oh. And my book just ends with a brief author's note. And the image that Life magazine that I start the book with is shown in the author's note. I was 9 when ML, at first this was going to be called, I think, an afterword or something, and my editor read, he said, we make an author's note, it's so personal. I was when ML was killed. I don't remember where I was when I heard the news or the tone in my home later that night, or anything my parents said the next day or the next or the day of his funeral. All I've ever been able to retrieve from memory about those April 1968 days is the sight of a teacher at East Harlem's MES 146, an imposing, she who must be obeyed type, with tears on the rise at the mention of his name. I mean no disrespect by calling him ML. It's about recognizing that I grew up regarding the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as more statue than man. Someone I revered but to whom I couldn't relate, and so I did not truly appreciate him. To some extent, this book is my soul's journey into why that teacher in my elementary school cried, and why I sometimes wept as I listened to his sermons and speeches, read his writings, and processed others' written and material, written and visual renderings of his life in my search to see, to feel the man. Someone who could have lived a relatively comfortable life. And I remind kids, I say, you know, with Montgomery, he ain't go rather than ride the bus, they had a car. It wasn't their flight. Someone who could have lived a relatively comfortable life, but instead spent thousands of hours, thousands of days, what turned out to be the last 13 years of his life, marching, preaching, praying for a righteous America, all the while a bullseye on his back. And he, Dr. King, Rev. Michael, Mike, Martin, NL, he was the first to state that he was not a saint but a sinner, shorthand for one who misses the mark when it comes to perfection. I chose not to detail his flaws because I was hard-pressed to see how that helps us focus on the dream, which is what I think he would want, what I think we need. I was in the middle of this book in the summer of 2005 when Hurricane Katrina hit, billboarding America's rocks. Tens of thousands of people were left to fend for themselves for far too long, black, brown, white. So many were elderly, so many were children. Overwhelmingly, they were poor. I stopped work on this book feeling, what's the point, wondering, does anyone really care about the dream? One of the things that helped me to get back on track is something Hurricane Katrina revealed, as did 9/11, as does the existence of shelters and food pantries and clothing banks. It is that America abounds with people who reflexively rise up for rescue in times of disaster, offering their time, talent, and treasure for the sake of people they may not know, caring, sharing, trying to bind up wounds, not giving a hoot about color, class, gender, sexuality, religion, or politics. I believe that this speaks to the seed of a sense of the beloved community, a longing to live agapic, an ache for the dream to be real. May you do your part, and that's how the book ends. And I was still angry when I wrote the first author's note, and the line ended, I hope this book hasn't been a waste of anyone's time. And then a friend of mine said, Tonya, you're writing for my son Stephen. And so I retrieved from memory his photo with him and wrote the last line, may you do your part. And in closing, I would just say that yes, were he alive, I think that 80-year-old MLK would be in or en route to D.C. to witness history. And I also believe that he would be praying that during and after the celebration, that we be not confused about his dream, but of renewed strength to rise up with greater readiness, to stand with a greater determination, to move on in these present era powerful days, these days of challenge, to make America what it ought to be. And that's all I have to